These are what we call in the law lies, Paul. We call them lies.
The footage wasn't leaked in a rush. It was released deliberately. When Megyn Kelly introduced what she described as previously unseen video tied to a past public moment involving Meghan Markle, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Insiders say Meghan's response was not disbelief, but fury, not at the content alone, but at the timing. Because timing, in reputational battles, is everything. What followed was not a public rebuttal. It was a scramble behind the scenes. Phones lit up, advisors convened, language was weighed word by word. Damage control did not announce itself, it activated. This is the story of how unseen footage reopens settled narratives, and how crisis management begins long before the public realizes it has started.
She doesn't think it's too much work. She would give her eye teeth to have more work like she did in the With Megyn special.
The release was calculated, not chaotic. According to media watchers tracking the moment, Megyn Kelly did not frame the video as a revelation meant to shock. She framed it as context. That choice mattered. Context invites reassessment rather than outrage, and reassessment can be far more destabilizing. What Kelly described as unseen footage was not obscure in origin. It had existed within archives, production reels, or extended recordings tied to a previously aired public moment involving Meghan Markle. It was unseen not because it was hidden, but because it had never been foregrounded. The distinction is subtle, but critical. In media terms, unseen does not mean secret. It means unused. Kelly's decision to surface it now reframed a narrative many believed had settled. Video carries a different authority than testimony or recollection. It compresses interpretation. Viewers feel they are seeing something directly, even when framing still exists. That immediacy bypasses layers of mediation and lands with unusual force.
People, it was like they loved her in 2018 when she married Prince Harry. Then shortly thereafter, they hated her because she started calling everyone racist.
Commentators noticed how carefully the footage was introduced. There was no sensational music, no aggressive commentary. Kelly let the images do most of the work before offering analysis. That restraint amplified impact. When a critic does not appear eager to persuade, persuasion becomes easier. The immediate reaction among media analysts was less about the content than about its implications. If this footage existed, what else would have been archived? If one clip could be recontextualized, how many other moments might look different when revisited? The story expanded beyond a single video into a broader question about narrative completeness. Inside Meghan's circle, insiders described the reaction as swift and intense, not disbelief, but anger. The fury, according to those familiar with her thinking, was directed less at what the footage showed and more at the loss of control over timing. In reputational management, timing is leverage. Once it is taken away, options narrow. The footage disrupted a carefully stabilized story. For years, public understanding of the moment had relied on edited segments and recollections. Introducing additional visuals unsettled that stability. Even if the footage did not outright contradict prior accounts, it complicated them. That complication triggered an immediate internal assessment. Advisors reportedly asked the same questions institutions always ask when visuals surface. What does it show? What does it omit? How will it be interpreted without explanation? A video does not need to be accusative to be challenging. It only needs to exist. Media reaction unfolded in stages. First came replay. Clips circulated with minimal commentary. Then came comparison. Side-by-side analyses of what audiences had previously seen versus what was now visible. Only later did opinions settle in. By that point, the footage had already reframed perception. Kelly's role in this phase was catalytic. She did not insist on a conclusion. She presented material and invited viewers to judge. That approach shielded her from accusations of an agenda while placing pressure squarely on the subject. When critics act as curators rather than prosecutors, their influence widens.
Fun to make fun of the special, the first season. And then we had to pretend that the second season was real, but it wasn't. It was very, very fake, just like it's...
For Megyn, the sense of being blindsided stemmed from familiarity. She has navigated hostile coverage before. What made this different was the format. Words can be contextualized. Video resists that. It fixes posture, tone, and sequence. Even when interpretation varies, the image remains constant. Insiders say the anger also reflected frustration with permanence. Once footage circulates, it cannot be recalled. Statements can be updated. clarifications can be issued. Images persist unchanged. That permanence transforms a moment into a reference point. The timing intensified the reaction. The footage did not emerge during a crisis when attention might be diffused. It appeared during a relatively quiet cycle, ensuring focus. Quiet cycles amplify disruption because nothing else is competing for attention. Observers noted that Kelly's release did not prompt immediate denial from Meghan's camp. That silence was strategic, not stunned. Video demands a different response than an allegation. Responding too quickly risks validating the framing. Waiting carries its own risk. Behind the scenes, advisors reportedly debated whether the footage required engagement at all. Ignoring visuals can allow them to define the narrative unchallenged. Addressing them can amplify reach. The dilemma had no easy answer. What made the moment especially volatile was its familiarity. Viewers recognized the setting. They remembered the original broadcast. Familiarity breeds confidence. When additional footage alters a familiar scene, audiences reassess with heightened interest. The fury insiders describe was not theatrical. It was controlled, compressed, and directed inward. Meetings were convened. Language was drafted and redrafted. The question was not how to attack Kelly, but how to manage interpretation without escalating conflict. Kelly's restraint complicated that task. There was no inflammatory rhetoric to rebut, no obvious misstatement to correct. The footage stood largely on its own. Challenging it required nuance, not outrage. As the clip continued to circulate, one thing became clear. The story was no longer about what Kelly thought. It was about what viewers thought they saw. Once perception shifts to first-person interpretation, control diminishes. This was the moment damage control began in earnest. Not publicly, but structurally. Assessing exposure, modeling response, choosing silence or engagement. The machinery activated quietly, aware that the wrong move could harden the very narrative it sought to soften. The footage had done its work simply by appearing. The power of video lies in its refusal to negotiate. Once images exist, they do not argue, explain, or adjust. They sit in place and invite interpretation. That is why the release unsettled Meghan Markle's team more than any written critique ever had. Words can be challenged. Video simply waits. Media analysts were quick to point out that the footage itself did not need to be dramatic to be effective. Its impact came from sequence, tone, and context. Small details viewers had never seen before now carried disproportionate weight. A pause held longer than expected, a reaction framed differently, an exchange that looked less polished than memory had preserved. These are not accusations, they are recalibrations. What made the situation uniquely difficult was that the video bypasses intermediaries. There is no journalist filter to blame, no headline to dispute. Audiences believe they are witnessing something directly, even when framing still exists. That perception of directness short-circuits traditional reputation management. For years, Meghan's public narrative has been shaped through explanation. Interviews, statements, carefully chosen platforms. Video disrupts that model because it predates explanation.
This is all lies to try to make her look more successful than she is, which is really the tagline of her entire professional life.
It shows before it tells. Once viewers form impressions, the explanation feels reactive rather than clarifying. This is why advisors often fear visuals more than hostile commentary. A critical op-ed can be countered with another op-ed. A clip circulates without commentary at all and still shapes opinion. Silence does not stop it. Engagement amplifies it. The choice is never clean. Observers noted that Megyn Kelly understood this dynamic well. By minimizing her own voice and letting the footage breathe, she reduced the appearance of an agenda. The less she insisted on meaning, the more viewers supplied it themselves. The media cycle reflected that shift almost immediately. Coverage moved away from debate and toward analysis. Panels paused the footage frame by frame. Comparisons were drawn between the original broadcast and the extended material. The question was no longer who was right, but what had been missed. That question is dangerous for any public figure because it suggests an incomplete picture. Even when nothing improper is revealed, the idea that something was unseen invites curiosity. Curiosity sustains attention longer than outrage. Inside Meghan's camp, the recognition set in quickly. Video alters hierarchy. It elevates audience judgment over expert commentary. Once people feel they have seen for themselves, persuasion becomes harder. You are no longer shaping narrative. You are responding to perception. The difference between edited clips and extended footage also became central. Supporters argued that raw video lacks context. Critics countered that rawness is precisely what gives it credibility. Both positions can coexist, but neither neutralizes the footage's effect. Another complicating factor was permanence. Clips were shared across platforms with varying commentary. Some versions stripped away Kelly's analysis entirely, leaving only the images. Others layered their opinion on top. Control over framing was fragmented instantly. For Megyn, this fragmentation was infuriating because it removed centralized management. In previous controversies, the response could be coordinated around a single narrative. Here, there were dozens. Each viewer encountered the footage differently, shaped by algorithm and bias. The psychological impact of that loss of control should not be underestimated. Insiders describe frustration bordering on disbelief. The footage did not accuse. It did not editorialize. It simply existed, and existence, in this case, was enough to destabilize. The ripple effect extended to Prince Harry as well. According to those close to him, he recognized immediately how visuals change the stakes. He has long criticized media's selective editing. Extended footage complicates that critique. It raises uncomfortable questions about what editing conceals and what it protects. Harry's instinct was caution. Video creates a long tail. Responding emotionally can lock in interpretations that might otherwise fade. His concern was not just the current clip, but precedent. Once audiences expect unseen footage to surface, past moments are never fully settled. Media strategists watching the situation agreed on one point. Video resets the board. It does not decide outcomes, but it forces repositioning. Silence becomes riskier. Engagement becomes costlier. Waiting becomes its own strategy. What makes this phase particularly volatile is that video rarely produces immediate conclusions. It produces slow shifts. Viewers revisit. Commentators reassess. Over time, perceptions recalibrate subtly rather than dramatically. That slow burn is harder to counter than a spike of outrage. Kelly's role in this recalibration was not that of an accuser, but that of a curator. By choosing what to show and when, she altered context without asserting motive. That approach insulated her from direct rebuttal while placing sustained pressure on the subject. For Megyn, the fury insiders describe was rooted in that asymmetry. There was no clear opponent to confront, no claim to dismantle, only images circulating freely, indifferent to explanation. This is why damage control becomes so complex when video enters the equation. The usual tools feel blunt. The statements sound defensive. Silence feels evasive. Humor feels inappropriate. Outrage looks insecure. As the footage continued to circulate, the conversation shifted again. It moved from the clip itself to what it represented, the fragility of managed narratives, the power of archives, the reality that nothing recorded ever truly disappears. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear to everyone involved. The story was no longer about Megyn Kelly's intent or Megyn's response. It was about how visuals, once released, rewrite the rules of engagement. And those rules do not favor control.
So of course there's no third season. They couldn't even get people to watch the fake second season. It was down at the bottom of the Netflix ratings. And right now, whatever those two touch turns.
The response did not begin with a statement. It began with silence that was anything but passive. According to people familiar with the discussions, Meghan Markle's team moved quickly to contain variables before addressing perception. When a video reframes a narrative, the first priority is not rebuttal. It is an exposure assessment. Advisors reportedly gathered to map the clip's trajectory, where it had originated, which platforms were amplifying it, how it was being cut, captioned, and repackaged. The same footage can carry radically different meanings depending on context, and context fractures once algorithms take over. Control, in that environment, becomes probabilistic rather than absolute. The initial debate was stark. Engage early and risk validating the footage as definitive. Stay silent and let the interpretation harden. Both paths carried a cost. The video does not fade quickly, but the commentary does. The calculation favored endurance over speed. Those close to Megyn describe her reaction as furious but contained. Not a loss of composure, but a tightening. The anger was directed inward, at the mechanics of exposure rather than the content itself. The footage did not accuse her of wrongdoing. It undermined certainty. That distinction mattered because certainty had been the foundation of previous defenses. Crisis advisors urged a familiar principle: do not fight images with adjectives. Viewers trust what they believe they see more than what they are told. Any statement would need to add information, not opinion. Anything less would read as spin. Behind the scenes, language was tested and discarded. Drafts were written and abandoned. Each version risked repeating the same problem. Explaining visuals often draws more attention to them. Clarifying context can sound like excuse-making. Denial feels unnecessary when no accusation has been made. The focus shifted toward containment through omission. Reduce the number of new variables. Limit public appearances. Avoid unscripted moments. Let the cycle burn itself out without fuel. This is standard crisis doctrine, but it requires discipline when emotions are high. According to insiders, Prince Harry played a moderating role. He has lived through enough media cycles to recognize the danger of escalation. His view was pragmatic. Video has a long tail. The less you add, the fewer points of comparison exist later. Statements become artifacts. Silence does not. That position was not universally welcomed. Those advocating engagement argued that absence can be interpreted as a concession. The counter-argument was blunt. Engagement converts footage into controversy. Controversy extends lifespan. The goal was not to win the moment, but to shorten it. The decision was settled on strategic restraint. No direct response to Kelly. No attack on motive. No demand for retraction. Anything framed as confrontation would have elevated the footage's significance and granted it institutional validation. This approach mirrored the tactics of organizations rather than individuals. Treat the event as an external shock, not a personal insult. Manage exposure. Protect future positioning. Allow time to dilute the impact. The practical implications were immediate. Media requests went unanswered. Potential appearances were postponed or quietly canceled. Social channels remained static. The absence of reaction was itself a message, though not one easily read. Observers noticed the shift. Commentators speculated about panic precisely because nothing was said. Silence invites projection. Yet insiders insist the silence was deliberate. Panic looks chaotic. This looked controlled. Internally, attention turned to precedent. If unseen footage could surface once, it could surface again. Advisors began auditing past appearances for similar vulnerabilities. Long-form recordings, extended cuts, behind-the-scenes material. Anything archived represents latent risk. This audit did not assume malice. Archives exist because production requires them. The risk lies in recontextualization. Moments that seemed unremarkable at the time can acquire meaning when revisited under a different narrative. That realization introduced a longer-term shift in strategy. Future engagements would be evaluated not only for immediate optics, but for archival survivability. How would this moment look stripped of explanation years from now? Video forces that question earlier than most public figures prefer. Meghan's anger, insiders say, evolved into determination. Not to confront the footage, but to avoid creating conditions that could lead to similar disruptions. That meant tighter control over environments, fewer extended recordings, clearer boundaries around access. The irony was not lost on advisors. Control is often what invites scrutiny. Yet in moments like this, the instinct to reduce exposure intensifies rather than fades. Damage control tends to narrow rather than open. Harry's caution remained consistent. He warned against overcorrecting. Retreating too far can look like avoidance. The balance between presence and protection is fragile. His concern was not just this cycle, but the next one as well. Overreaction now could become context later. As days passed, the immediate heat cooled, but the footage remained in circulation. That persistence reinforced the original lesson. Video does not need continuous amplification to matter. It settles into the background, available for recall whenever related stories arise. The damage control phase did not end with resolution. It transitioned into monitoring, tracking sentiment, watching engagement patterns, waiting for the next inflection point. This is the quiet work of reputation management when no clean counterstrike exists. What defined this phase was restraint under pressure, anger without eruption, panic without chaos. The machinery functioned as designed, absorbing shock rather than amplifying it. Whether the strategy succeeded depends on the time frame. In the short term, escalation was avoided. In the long term, the footage became part of the permanent record. That permanence cannot be managed away. It can only be contextualized over time. The final outcome of damage control is rarely victory. It is survival, preserving enough flexibility to move forward without being trapped by a single moment. In that sense, the response achieved its narrow aim. The footage did not become a public showdown. It became a reference point, quietly influential, permanently available. And that is often the best result when images enter the story on their own terms. What lingered after the immediate response was not outrage, but permanence. Once the footage circulated, it ceased to belong to the moment in which it was recorded. It became a reference point, detachable from its original context and endlessly reusable. That is the quiet danger of archived video. It does not expire. It waits. For Meghan Markle, the most destabilizing realization was not that the footage existed, but that it could resurface indefinitely. Advisors emphasized a hard truth. Every future discussion touching similar themes would now carry an unspoken footnote. Viewers would remember what they believed they had seen, even if they could not articulate why it mattered. This is how reputational gravity works in the digital age. A single clip rarely collapses a narrative outright. Instead, it alters the trajectory. It bends interpretation just enough to affect how new information is received. Statements that once landed neutrally begin to feel rehearsed. Silence that once conveyed dignity now looks calculated. The anger that followed the release gradually gave way to a colder assessment. Damage control had limited immediate fallout, but it could not undo the structural shift. Video introduces asymmetry. It privileges observation over explanation. Once that asymmetry exists, the burden of proof subtly reverses. Megyn Kelly's role in this phase remained indirect. She did not escalate. She did not continue pushing the clip. Her restraint reinforced the sense that the footage was not an attack, but an artifact. Artifacts are harder to dismiss because they do not argue back. Commentators began framing the episode less as controversy and more as a case study. Panels discussed the ethics of archival release. Media analysts examined how unused footage acquires power over time. The conversation broadened beyond Megyn to the mechanics of modern media itself. That broadening was a double-edged sword. It reduced personal heat while embedding the clip into a larger narrative about trust, editing, and authenticity. Being an example rather than an exception carries its own cost. Examples persist longer than scandals. Inside Megyn's camp, strategy adjusted accordingly. The goal shifted from rebuttal to insulation. Fewer environments where extended footage could be captured. Greater insistence on controlled formats. Tighter agreements around usage and ownership. These measures were not punitive. They were preventative. Yet prevention carries a perception risk. The more tightly access is managed, the more audiences suspect management. This paradox is familiar to anyone navigating public life. Openness invites scrutiny. Control invites suspicion. The balance is narrow and unforgiving. Prince Harry recognized this tension clearly. Those close to him say he worried less about the clip itself and more about precedent. If unseen footage could reframe one moment, it could do so again. His concern was long-term. How to engage publicly without creating archives that might later be weaponized. The episode also reshaped how silence was understood. In earlier disputes, silence was framed as a sign of strength. Here, silence risked appearing evasive. The difference lay in the medium. Video invites commentary even without a response. It does not require engagement to sustain interest. Over time, the cycle slowed. New stories emerged, attention diffused, but the footage remained, quietly accessible. That is how old moments become new problems. They do not dominate headlines. They resurface as context. For Megyn, adapting meant accepting that not every narrative can be closed. Some remain partially open, reactivated by circumstances beyond control. The fury she initially felt softened into resolve, not to correct the past, but to manage the future more tightly. Critics argued that such management reinforces the very dynamics that invite scrutiny. Supporters countered that self-protection is rational in a media environment that profits from reinterpretation. Both positions hold truth. Neither eliminates risk. What this episode ultimately revealed was the fragility of curated memory. Public figures often believe that once a moment passes, it settles. Archival footage challenges that belief. It reminds everyone that the past can be edited again. The damage control succeeded in one sense. There was no prolonged feud, no escalation into public sparring. The story did not metastasize into daily headlines, but success was limited. The clip became part of the record. That record will be consulted again. In reputational terms, this is neither victory nor defeat. It is adjustment, learning to operate with a new variable in play, acknowledging that images, once released, reduce flexibility forever. The long-term impact will be subtle. Analysts will cite the footage when discussing authenticity. Supporters will contextualize it. Critics will reference it obliquely. It will surface when convenient and fade when not. That is the life cycle of visual artifacts. For Megyn, the challenge moving forward lies in reconciling control with credibility. Overmanagement can undermine trust, while unmanaged exposure invites distortion. The solution, if one exists, is imperfect and situational. The episode also serves as a reminder to institutions and individuals alike. Archives are not neutral, they are dormant narratives. Whoever wakes them shapes the conversation. Megyn Kelly did not create new facts. She reintroduced existing material. That act alone shifted perception. It demonstrated how power in media often lies not in discovery, but in timing. As the dust settled, one conclusion became unavoidable. In a world where everything is recorded, nothing is ever fully finished. Moments can be revisited, reframed, and reassessed long after participants believe them closed. Damage control, in that context, is not about erasing impact. It is about living with it. And that is the lasting consequence of unseen footage becoming seen. In the digital age, nothing stays buried. It waits. If you want sharp, grounded breakdowns of how footage reshapes power and why damage control begins before denial, subscribe, share your take, and stay with us as we track how old moments return with new force.